Today I'm going to talk a little bit about ReactPHP and PHP-PM, but we'll get there. There's a little bit of a storytelling before. So first of all, this is me, Albert Casademont, from Catalan pronunciation. I'm the head of IT at Nustic. Nustic is a small startup here based in Barcelona. Probably never heard about us. We're still in the development stages of a hardware device that allows you to make your own perfume. So it's a little bit of a weird thing, but I didn't know anything about perfume before joining this company. I don't know anything about perfume still right now, but it's something that's probably going to catch up in the next few years, hopefully. So the story comes here 3 years ago when I was presenting at this same stage. This is me back then, 3 years ago. Talking kinda about the same thing. Maybe of you were there 3 years ago at the Symfony Catalonia conference. Back then it was a little bit of a crazy project that I was presenting, like this random project that Mark Schmidt was doing and the ReactPHP guys were doing. But I think in those 3 years, the ecosystem around ReactPHP and PHP-PM and other SWOL, for example, that Enrico is going to present later on, have catched up a little bit. So I think now it's time to recap on what we saw 3 years ago. I think that ReactPHP and PHP-PM are kind of production ready. That's what I wanted to tell you the story about, how we did it, and we're doing it live with ReactPHP. So I'm a performance junkie, really, I am. This is all about performance, because, yeah, that's what I really like. I used to work in an e-commerce before, Ulabox, there are some guys here, and for us, performance was like one of the key things that we wanted to do, because, as you know, performance, it's especially for an e-commerce, the more performance you get out of your PHP application, the happier that your customers are, the more conversions you have, and actually the more money you get. So it's simple as that. And of course, the less resources you use on servers, etc. So performance is a thing that everyone should be aiming for. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of the extreme about that, because, PHP already has some really good performance. When I did the talk 3 years ago, PHP 7 was there already, but not so much adoption. I asked the question back then, and not so many people were using still PHP 7 back then. So the first thing you do if you care about performance, please upgrade already to PHP, not 7, but 7.3. PHP 7 is already, end of life, so don't do that anymore. But please upgrade. Don't care about what I'm going to explain at all before upgrading to PHP 7. This is the biggest performance gain you can have, okay? So before doing the silly things I'm going to show you after, do this. And of course, this opcache. This is the second biggest thing you can do to improve the performance of your PHP applications. And do it the right way, So deploy deploy your application, restart the containers, prime the opcache. Just don't do it like out of the box. There are some configs that you can tune, memory. Just check the stats. Do it the right way. You can disable on production the checking every 2 seconds on the file, the times if you have modified them. So you don't need to do that in production. So take it off, and you gain some performance. But after you've done that, normally you will have, of course, you can do much more, some optimizations to your framework. If you're using Symfony, Laravel, etc., you can tune your queries. So you end up to a point where you, as I said, a performance junkie, where you really want more. And you want more just for the sake of it, just for the fun of it. It's going well. PHP is fast, really, it's fast. Don't let anybody tell you that PHP is slow. It's not anymore. It's not. But, sometimes we have developers like to have fun and see where we can make things go. So why not? Let's try to do it. I want to squeeze a little bit more out of performance of PHP. And the only way to do it, to be honest, is to really hook up into the PHP internals and see what was going on. And that's what I'm going to show you. This is Blackfyre. I'm not endorsed or sponsored by Blackfyre, but I think it's really great profiler. And it's easy to use because I'm not really a super ops guy. And for me, configuring one of the other typical profilers that we had back then is a little bit more difficult. And moreover, you weren't really sure about running your profilers on production, whereas with Blackfyre, you can actually do it and with a really low overhead. So this is what you get on a very optimized, this is Symfony, this is a Symfony app. And this is what you get when you run Blackfyre on a really, it's not that simple. It's a simple controller with a twig file that says hello world. So this is what you actually get. And I'm going to come here because I'm doing some things today a little bit different. Let's see if this works. So as you can see, you have lots of things here. But as you start reading the list, you realize there's nothing much related to your actual code. Where's your controller? You don't even see it here. Because PHP, and especially the bigger your framework environment is, the more it will spend, including files, the autoloading here, building more autoloading, more autoloading, more autoloading, more autoloading. And this is what actually is taking a lot of your request time. Actually, you have the environment, here it builds the request, so there's some useful things. But all these, as Rasmus was explaining yesterday and Nikita also, this gets trashed, okay? So you build all these things for every request, and after you build it, you execute your request, you finish the request, and everything gets trashed away. So I'm going to, let's see if it happens. You will realize why I'm a developer and not a graphics artist, but, just bear with me, okay? So I'm going to try to explain you. Nikita did it already a little bit yesterday, but I think it's nice to understand how actually PHP manages memory, because then when you understand this, it's when you know what things you can avoid doing, okay? I assume that most of you use PHP-FPM, which is kind of these days the recommended approach of doing it. So I would start with building the FPM here. And you have this black box. This is incoming. These are not actual HTTP requests. Remember that this is a fast CGI interface, so normally you would have Nginx or Apache on the front. And then here you're using opcache, right? So then you have here your opcache. You understand why I'm a developer, right? Okay. So you prime the cache. All these are files, APCU also sits here. So this is like a shared memory space. And here you have all the children that PHP-FPM. You can declare the number of children. It's a directive. You can set it up either in a static way or a dynamic way. It keeps adjusting. But you get this, okay? So now when a request comes in, I'm going to show you the request. You get it. The master FPM assigns it to one of the workers, and then the worker starts building up its request context. So now we will start fetching. First of all, it will fetch the file you're using. We're assuming Symfony, for example. You would start with the front-end controller, the index.php, which would load from the opcache. And will be the autoloading, and then a lot of classes, and it keeps bringing things from here to your request tag, okay? So now you've built those is what we were seeing on the Blackfyre. All these things that are being copied from the off cache to the request memory. And now the request executes, and all of a sudden you produce a response that you send back, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm going to try to erase these things. Let's see if everything gets wiped out, seriously, like nothing. And, it starts all over again. And to be honest, I think that's a little bit of a waste. It has its good things. I think Rasmus pointed out those good things yesterday really good. But it also has some bad things. And you pay a performance price for this. So really, what do we do? Are we happy about it? We could do something more about it? Actually, yes. I was talking to Derek right now, and PHP 4 is coming in 15 days, something like that, on the 28th of November. And as Rasmus also Nikita pointed out, this coming the preload script. And this, it will offset some of the things I said before. But it comes also, here's the RFC. I encourage you to read it, and understand how it works. But it's not that simple. You have to give off cache a script, a PHP script, that it will run, and then from that script it will preload everything that you need. But you need to write that script. Ideally, it was thought that Composer would be doing this. Composer would be creating this preload file for you. But at the end, after there's a Composer PR issue open, but at the end they said it's not really up to them to do it because they don't know what's really the important things that you want to preload in your application. So Composer is not going to do that for you. You're going to have to do it yourself. So it's probably a really nice thing. I'm really looking forward to try it, but it won't be as easy as we thought it would be. Okay? So what comes next, really? What can we do about it? Many of you probably have heard about ReactPHP. It's an asynchronous HTTP server that can do some really nice things for you. And I'm going to show you how it looks. It's a very different way of programming. I'm not going to deep dive on ReactPHP today. I'm going to explain more a little bit later, but really, the docs are really nice, and I encourage you to go read them. But this is how a ReactPHP looks like. You know, it's different. If you've played with Node.js, it will probably remind you as a Node.js app, because you actually do things in a little bit different way. But I'm going to show you again how different this is. This is your PHP process, actually. Oh, it's not writing anymore? Great. Oh, I have the... Sorry. Okay, it's writing. Okay. So this is the PHP process. This becomes a CLI process. You run it, right, as is. Wait. No, you know what I'm going to do, right? A question mark PHP. If not, this is not going to compile. Now it compiles. So you run this. You open up a CLI script, and you fire this, and we'll open a socket, as you can see here, on the port on an HTTP port, and now it will start processing your requests as they come. But the interesting thing here is that everything from here to here will stay in memory forever until you kill the process. When a request comes in, only this part is what is executed for every request. It's a very simple request. It just returns a hello world. But the nice thing, the idea that I want you to get from this is that you are actually running only once everything which is outside the event loop. That's how we call it. But everything that's outside, as I said, you run it only once, which is great for memory because the memory stays. You know, you don't trash the memory after every request. So everything stays put for you in every request, which is great, but it also have some problems of its own, as you can imagine. Why? Because you cannot rely on globals anymore. If you come back to here, if you had a variable here, let's say assume $i equals 0, you could increment it. I don't have much space. Imagine this. Okay, you could do this, a++, a++. And after every request, you would keep, this would work as a kind of a counter. This variable, which is outside the actual event loop, will never get freed. So this memory stays for you. You take it as a global, but you need to be really careful with globals once you go the ReactPHP way because you cannot use them. You need to be really careful about them, especially when you're working with big frameworks. I'm going to point it out, but if you work with Doctrine, you work with Monologue, there's a lot of things that can stay behind after every request that you need to clear or make sure if you really want them or not for the next request. So keep in mind that it's not that really no globals, but you shouldn't rely on the globals, okay? $get, $post, $cookie, all these global variables that we kind of like to use, especially on the older days on PHP. So you have to rely on everything getting put to you. Again, if I come back, you'll see that you get the request here, a PSR request, and you answer with a PSR response. You cannot echo things anymore and expect PHP to build a nice response for you. It's not going to work like that anymore. If you actually echo here, it will be printed out on the CLI console, not on the request. So you really have to work kind of in a different way. If you're using a framework like Laravel or Symfony, this is mostly already done for you, so you don't have to care much. You never interact with the global variables, actually. So you normally interact with the request and response objects, which matches quite a lot with what we're doing here. And the other important thing is Acing IO. You know, you only get one process here. You only get one process, really. So every request is going to be processed by the same process. What does that mean? I'm going to explain it a little bit with a little more complicated example. Here, we are receiving a request, and we are querying a database, and then we are producing a response. If you're used to Node.js, you already know what this is. This is called promises. So it's kind of a promise that you send me something, and I promise you that when this thing comes back, I will execute some other calls. This is made through callbacks, so you end up kind of a little, if you've done JavaScript and Node.js, the callback hell, but it's really a little bit of a paradigm shift, so it gets a little bit your mind to adjust to this. It's not that easy, but you end up grasping it. So this is the event loop I was talking about. So now when you do that, actually the request comes as is. You know, you have one loop, it's called the event loop, that keeps running. It's a while true, actually. It keeps running all the time, this script. It never ends. When you do the listen here, this actually runs this loop for you. Okay? So now this loop is running, and an HTTP request comes in, and we'll execute this bit of the code. Okay? So we'll execute a little bit of this, and we execute the query. So we process a little bit of PHP with just a tiny bit of the SQL here, and we emit this callback here that you have from here. You emit the query, and you say, OK, after the query ends, I'm going to execute this bit of code. So actually send out the MySQL query, and you halt the execution. You finish the execution of the loop, and the loop continues, and if there's another request coming, it will execute that same request, okay? And it will keep pushing things to the database. Imagine it's a long query, so it takes like 10 seconds to process. You get another request, you process the first bit, and you send to MySQL, okay. But now MySQL returns, it comes back, you know, and now, only now, it executes this other bit of code, it executes here, and then sends back the response. And when the other query comes, it will do the same thing, and it will do the same thing, okay? So this is how you actually get parallel. I really loved the way Kat described it yesterday, between parallel execution and async execution. What you're getting here is async execution. It's not really parallel. You only have one process. You are kind of playing with input and output to be able to halt the execution of your process, do some other things, and then when this other thing finishes, then you can resume your execution. But it's not really parallel requests. You are not doing requests in parallel. You just expect that you will have at some point one of these promises, one input and output, and then it can halt the execution, do something more, and then continue on, okay? But this is hard. This is not obvious, and I want to explain why. Because PHP is not really suited for that. You saw that we are not using the normal MySQL query. For example, we are using a special React MySQL driver, as you can see here, because PHP is not really suited for async execution. And this is really interesting to see, because once a request comes in, imagine that we're doing this long query the old way. Okay, so now we execute it. We'll execute the query here, and then we produce a response. If we do the old way, MySQL query, this will actually block the execution of the whole process. It will block the execution, and only when the query resumes, it will restart the process. This is actually how the operating system handles in and output calls, other system calls too. But this is the basic thing, okay? So even though you've had a request here that was trying to come, another request, it won't come here. It will come here. So you actually don't have like this. Whereas in, with an async request, while it's executing the query, you can have the other HTTP request, and here you have the MySQL query. So it's a very different way of doing things, but PHP out of the box doesn't support that. So it really needs, if you want to use your PHP applications that you have right now in ReactPHP, you will have to do a lot of refactor, because you will have to use async input and output libraries for everything, like file system. Even a sleep, when you sleep the process, that's a blocking function. It will really block the whole process and won't do anything more. So you'll have a sleep async function, a file system async function, a MySQL query async function. There's a lot of things going on the ReactPHP community. So you'll have adapters for almost a lot of things. But it's not simple. It's quite hard to actually move an application that you already have built to the ReactPHP environment. It's quite complicated. It's very nice for new applications, so I suggest you try it out, because it's a very interesting thing, especially if you've seen Node.js, and you can squeeze a lot of the performance out of it, because as I said, your autoloading, your dependency injection container, all those two things, for example, you can keep them in memory because they don't change per request. It almost stays the same. So you can preload everything on the first request, dependency injection also on the first request, and then when everything comes in, you just execute your business logic, but you get to use the same autoloading, the same dependency injection container after every request. But as I said, it's hard. So what do we do if you have an existing PHP Symfony application, for example? This is where PHP-PM or PPM comes in. This was a project started by Mark Schmidt. It's not a project of mine. But I think it really bridges the best of both worlds, because it's actually kind of a substitute, like a replacement for your FPM. So PPM actually would like to be a replacement for your FPM. And the way it works, I'm going to do the same graph here before, but now instead of FPM, I have PPM. PPM has an HTTP interface, so it's a little bit different. It's not fast CGI, but it's kind of the same thing, okay? So what we'll do, you will have the workers, again, same thing. You can define the number of workers you want, and each of those workers is a React PHP worker. So you don't use the React PHP worker like, as I mentioned before, exposing the HTTP interface directly, but you use PPM on the front. What does that solve? It's interesting. We now would preload everything again. First request comes in, you execute your business logic, and the request goes out. But now you only raise, what did I do? Sorry. After the request comes in, you only raise this part, but you get to keep all this memory, which is what we were aiming for. If you remember in the first place, we were aiming to increase the performance by keeping the things that we can reuse for every request. So we keep these. And if another request comes in, this is already loaded. You just execute and finish. You just execute and finish, and you keep this. How do we deal with the problems I said with async? This is interesting, because as PHP is managing the requests,
You can do an async blocking call here. It's OK. It will block this one. But PHP-PM will see that, and the next request, it will be forwarded to the next React PHP worker. So now you can actually do blocking calls on... You can actually do blocking calls on your Symfony apps because you're using Doctrine, because you're using file get contents. You can do actually blocking calls here. It doesn't matter because PHP-PM will manage that for you. And if it sees the request hasn't finished, it will send it to another worker. So you kind of get, as I was saying, the best of both worlds because you actually expose one endpoint, same thing as a React PHP worker, but you have a different number of React PHP workers that you can use. So that solves quite a lot of problems, but memory leaks. Memory leaks are the biggest thing. Lorna was actually telling you about this a little bit before. When you're dealing with workers, you're dealing with long-running processes. PHP-PM, React PHP are long-running processes. They do stay put for a lot of time. And you get memory leaks. You get memory leaks without knowing it. For example, if you're buffering some logging after every request, if you don't remember to clear that buffer after every request, you're increasing the memory and you are not really using it. That's not really a memory leak. A lot of people call memory leaks to things that are not really memory leaks, but it's something that you need to be much more aware of. In the old way of doing PHP, everything gets wiped out after every request. That's great. You don't have to care for it. Next request gets a whole new thread. But with memory leaks, now here with the long-running process, you need to be much more aware of your memory management. It's not that you have to go to the C level of, immalloc and freeing things, but you need to keep track a little bit of it, and you have to inspect your processes from time to time to really see if you're leaking memory. I mean, if you're leaking memory, you'll see it because you reach the memory limit, and the PHP-PM process will crash, okay? It can restart the worker. PHP-PM can restart the worker if it crashes. It will do that for you, but, it crashes. The request, if there was a request incoming, it will crash. That request is not good anymore. Actually, when preparing for this talk, we found a memory leak in PHP in the core itself. So that was my first pull request to the PHP core. I think Nikita, I don't know if Nikita's here, but he was actually merging my pull request. So thank you, Nikita, for merging my memory leak fix for PHP. And that was really, really interesting. So keep track of your memory because it's really important, because now you have to be a little bit more aware of your memory. And of course, as I said before, you really need to be careful with your state doctrine. Doctrine is actually a memory cache. When you fetch things from the database, you put them in the unit of work, and after you finish, you flush them, but you don't do anything else. As you know, PHP recycles all the memory, everything's gone, fine, next request, fetches the database again, and it builds your in-memory ORM. But here, nobody will do that for you unless you do it. PHP-PM will do that for you. PHP-PM has some of these tricks already done for you. So after every request, PHP-PM will clear the doctrine cache for you so that you don't need to actually deal with it. But you need to know that when dealing with doctrine, this is something that you need to care about. As I said, bar dumps, echoes, again, the old way of debugging, bar dump, whatever, and you see it on the web, doesn't really work like this anymore. Again, PHP-PM actually does that for you because it starts a buffer before sending you the request, and after it finishes the buffer, it will send everything out. So you can actually use bar dump with PHP-PM. It will capture everything and will put it on the Symfony response for you. Code changes. What happens if my code changes? Now I'm talking about when I'm developing some code. This is a long-running process, so once you load everything, the file system is not touched anymore. You already have everything in memory. So every time you make a code change, you need to restart the React PHP workers. That's the way it works.
Thankfully, PHP-PM already does that for you. It has a file scanner, actually. It's a polling file scanner that looks for changes in your files. And when it detects a change in one of the PHP files you're using, it will restart all your React PHP workers. So this is already done for you. But I agree that developer experience might change a bit. It's a little bit worse. It's not terrible, but it's a little bit different from what you're used to, that you just hit reload, everything is reloaded again, and that's fine. Here, you need to be a little bit aware of, and to be honest, this is one of the things that PHP-PM could do a little bit better, the tracking of changes on your files. Sometimes it messes a little bit with the restarts. So this is an area to improve, but it's something that you need to care about, because it's not obvious. Going back, because we all started all this mess with React PHP and PPM for performance. So is there actually performance gain? Is there not? So it's time to check it out. Again, I'm going to show you a benchmark. Please never, as Matthias said it this morning, don't really trust advice from anyone. Do your own benchmarks. Don't trust what the screen will say, because it might not work for you. I'm going to tell you why this performance gain might be or not be what you were expecting. Okay? So this is, again, I already talked about this. This is what we were talking about. So first, on the first line, you have a request. Are you seeing PHP is fast? Come on. This is a Symfony app, a full Symfony app with a small controller. It doesn't do much, but it's a full Symfony framework loading with PHP, opcode, everything. So that's the first line. So you will see that the request, comes out pretty fast. The second line is the same thing with PHP-PM. So actually, you see a little bit of a latency gain. Again, it's not much, but on percentage, it's quite a lot. But again, this is, you need to really understand your code. If you have, the bigger your autoloading is, the bigger your dependency injection container is, the more gain you will have from using a solution like this. If you're not using actually autoloading, or your PHP code is that simple that you don't need a dependency injection container, your gains might be much lower than this. Or actually, it might be even worse, because there's some processing that PHP-PM needs to do for you, and that might be offsetting what you gain from the not autoloading dependency injection recycling. So again, it's faster. In percentage, it's quite a lot faster, but it's, in absolute terms, it's not that fast, okay? But again, measure it, know what you're doing. Maybe if you have an incredibly big dependency injection container, this can save you in the order of 20–25% of time, which is something really interesting to look upon, okay? And everything, of course, with these benchmarks were done with Nginx in front. So these benchmarks are not actually pure PHP benchmarks, are benchmarks made from the client side. Okay, so it's actually a full HTTP request back and forth. Okay, so it's faster, not a lot faster, but I think it's an interesting gain and something that you can really, if you're using Laravel or Symfony, it's really easy to try it out. Really, it's a matter of switching PHP-FPM with PHP-PM, and it will kind of work out of the box, okay? So is it worth it? I guess you know the answer. Depends. You never know, really. Again, I cannot say it's worth it for me, because we measure it. We mostly have a big REST API. We don't have a website. So mostly our Symfony code is a really big REST API. And for us, it's great, because the API is really fast. It's already really fast without PHP-PM and React PHP. But the autoloading costs are, the faster your logic is, the bigger the autoloading cost, the ratio is bigger also, because the faster you go, the fixed cost of autoloading, it's almost there. It doesn't matter if your logic is like this or this. It stays the same. So the more optimized your PHP code is, the bigger the autoloading cost becomes. Okay? So for us, for a REST API, it really did make sense to use it. It might not make sense if your request is already taking 1 second, for example. It probably won't be worth it, because you have bigger problems if your request takes 1 second, okay? But these won't solve things for you. It won't go from 1 second to 10 milliseconds. It won't be like that. So it depends. Try it. Look it out. I think there's some other nice things that you can look forward if you're using PHP-PM. I think it's nicer for if you're using containers, Docker, and Kubernetes. Why? Because a single PHP-PM the process exposes already an HTTP interface, which I think is nicer these days. FPM, as I said before, exposes a fast CGI that you really need an Nginx in front of it. It works that way. So for Dockerizing all these things, you need to think, oh, I'm going to put supervisor in a big fat container with the FPM and the Nginx. I'm going to do it in 2 separate containers. And if I'm using Kubernetes, I can put them in a single pod. But it's, again, you know, it's a little bit more work if you want to put PHP on an FPM container and Kubernetes. With this is nicer because you expose a single HTTP endpoint that you can use directly. We are using actually directly the Google Cloud. We're using Google Cloud. We're using the Google Cloud load balancers directly hitting our PHP-PM workers. PHP-PM has a static website server also. So if you have a small asset file, a JSON, CSS, PHP-PM will also serve that for you. So it kind of it's not a fully featured web server. Don't expose that directly to the internet. Please don't do that. It's not meant for that. But if you're using a big load balancer or something in front of it, you can already query your PHP-PM workers directly. So I think it's nicer. It has an advantage that if you're using Docker and Kubernetes to use a PHP-PM-based setup. That's one thing. And also, and I think this is really important and we don't value it, ReactPHP and PHP-PM are written, guess what? PHP. So you can actually read the code. Okay, it's not simple PHP. It has a lot of streams. It has a lot of weirdness with the callbacks and the promises. It's not that obvious if you're coming from a pure Sync language as PHP is. But if you're coming from Node.js, for example, it's kind of easy to see. And if you're not that familiar, you can actually open it. You just go on GitHub and open the ReactPHP project, and you see that it's plain PHP. It has sockets, it has streams, but it's PHP. Whereas if you want to try to debug PHP-FPM, it's C code. We're not super familiar with C code and all those Zend, whatever. There's a lot of Zend, whatever calls in PHP that you need to know quite a lot of internals these days to actually understand what's PHP doing under the hood. But with this, you can actually rewrite your PHP-PM fork or React-PHP fork. You can rewrite them and make a variation quite easily. Not that much with PHP-FPM, you have to read C code. So I think this is a huge advantage, really. I think that to be able to understand everything that happens on your request from the start to the end, you actually can debug everything. So if something is slow, you go see it. You don't need to, FPM is a black box. I don't know how to even look at it. The code is there. It's on GitHub. You can actually look at it, but it's not that simple. Some resources I really encourage you. I went really fast over the React-PHP thing. This was not really a talk about React-PHP. It was kind of throwing the idea back to you. It's now your turn to actually read some docs. The ReactPHP website.org is a really nice website. There's lots of documentations, lots of side projects with MySQL adapters, file system adapters to actually async almost everything. But as I said, it's a hard path. Do it with care. PHP-PM repo is also there. To be honest, I think it could use a little bit more love. I'm actually contributing to PHP-PM, so you will see some memory leak fixing by me. But really, I guess with a lot of open source projects these days, it's not actually clear who should manage it, who should pay for these things. That's a whole lot of topic. But if you have some time, really try PHP-PM. If you see bugs, if you see something that's not working as expected, please report it back. we'll try to fix it out and work it up, okay? So do it that, please, for me. Also, if you want to understand a little bit more about what the memory management of PHP and garbage collection, all these things, please look at this PHP link. It's really well explained. Please don't disable the garbage collection. As Nikita said it actually yesterday, it's not relevant anymore. You might think, oh, long running process, I'm going to disable the garbage collection. Don't do it. These days with PHP 7.3, actually garbage collection can save your life. It will prevent your workers from eating too much memory and crashing. So don't disable the GC because, you know, back in the composer bug, everything needs to be disabled on long-running processes. No, don't do it anymore. It's not a good advice, okay? And if you are a little bit more interested in starting building async applications with Symfony, there's a really nice project by a colleague of mine, Mark, which tries to bring the event loop that keeps continually running on the PHP, inside the Symfony kernel, so you can actually use that loop inside your controllers to do stuff, okay? If you want to do an async MySQL query, you can fetch the loop and do it with a callback and a promise. So if you're working with Symfony and you're interested in going the async way, this is a thing that you can check, and I think it's a really nice project that you can build upon. So I think that's all from me. Gracias. And happy to take some more questions. I know it was not an easy topic, so please feel free to ping me on Twitter or here at the conference. I will be here for the rest of the day. And please, I encourage you to try it out. Experiment a little bit different way of doing things in PHP. And to be honest, I'd hope this would be kind of a parallel PHP future. We'll see how it goes. So thank you again, and happy to take questions. Like this picture.
Well, there are like a million questions.
So a little bit younger here.
Yeah. So we'll do our best to like...
A million questions?
Well, not a million, but dozens, I guess. So the first one is obvious. Rasmus yesterday said that he didn't like the async idea, so he encouraged people to actually use queues and all that sort of stuff. What are your thoughts on that, like versus just...
I think queues are relevant. It doesn't, that you're processing requests in the async way doesn't mean that you need to do everything on the request loop. You can offset things and have another ReactPHP loop to process those queues. So I don't think it's really one thing or the other. Personally, my opinion, I was here for the performance, I was telling you. So I'm not really looking forward to go the full async way yet. Because you need to do, as I said, you need to do a lot of work in your current PHP code to make it work the async way. Really, there's a lot of work. There was we'll see, the idea that PHP 8 will bring quite a lot more async stuff on the PHP core. We'll see how it ends. To be honest, I haven't seen much activity on the internals list on the async stuff. I've seen more on the union types and these things that we were discussing yesterday. But hopefully, again, it's a matter of taste. If you like Node.js, I don't know how many people like Node.js here, but you like the async way of doing things. If you're really performance-obsessed guy like me, probably you think async is the good way because you're fully utilizing the CPU 100% if you do it the right way and you actually use the workers in a much more efficient way. But as I said, going the full async way is really hard. So that's why I like PHP-PM, because it sits a little bit in the middle. You don't go the full async way. You can actually start trying things, but you're only leveraging the fact that some things stay in memory after every request, and that gives you a performance increase. It's not going async, but you gain some of the things of going async.
So they're asking about comparing this to Sul, I guess that's how it's pronounced, that Enrico is presenting?
It's another way of doing it, to be honest. I tried ReactPHP first, and that's where I stayed. There was actually an idea to switch
PHP-PM is actually quite agnostic. It uses React PHP workers, but it could use Swole PHP workers. There was actually a pull request that we discussed if we actually wanted to change the default from React PHP to Swole. I don't know how to really pronounce it. Swole? Swole? I don't know.
No idea, man.
Enrico will tell us later,
Yeah, Enrico will tell us.
Really, use the one that you like the most. They are both fast, and they both work on the same idea of the event loop and the promises and all that stuff. So it's actually kind of similar. I don't have... My preference is React PHP, but that's because it's the thing I know. It's not...
Then there are a bunch of questions, like, obviously, like, why go through all this hassle having to submit a pull request to PHP instead of just writing Go, Java, or like, you know... Python.
I would go to Go. I don't like Go. I like PHP, you know? That's what we're here for. No, really.
Bravo.
No, hats off to Kat. I think I really liked her presentation yesterday. And I think it's really... I'm doing some C. You know, I like C code sometimes. And I encourage you to go to another language. But really, why do that in PHP? Why not? I mean, it's for the fun. I said it. I was happy with the performance of PHP 7 with Opcache. You know, it was blazingly fast. It was 4 milliseconds for a Symfony request. But, you know, sometimes on the weekends, you are not going out and you are bored at home and you say, why not? And you start using Blackfyre and you lose a ton of hours to save 1 millisecond. Why? Was it worth it? You know, sometimes developers do things for fun, and that's the way it is. I don't have a rational explanation for why I did what I did.
Then there are questions about...
But come on, submitting a pull request to PHP Core, that's
big respect.
You know, and having Nikita saying, oh, you should do this in the right way, and I said, yeah, you know, peace. You know, it's fantastic.
So how does this scale versus like adding multiple workers versus multiple FPM threads?
It should be the same thing as FPM. So if you have 100 workers in FPM, you could have 100 workers of PHP-PM. Again, if you go the full async way and your code is pure async, you should have as much workers as CPU cores. That's what the recommendation, if you set up an Nginx web server, the first advice is limit the number of workers to the maximum of number of cores. Don't do more, because you're already using 100% of the CPU in an efficient way. If you put more cores, it's not going to go faster. We put more cores in FPM or PHP-PM. Why? Because we deal with sync in output operations. So while one process is suspended, we can go to another process. That's why on FPM, normally you put much more children processes than CPU cores. But in an ideal async world, you should only put as much workers as CPU cores. So if you're trying to switch from FPM, you can use the same number of workers. We've seen some problems when massive parallel requests come at the same time to PHP-PM. I'm talking about the order of 1,000 parallel requests coming up at you. We've seen some problems with the sockets that sometimes they give timeouts. It's something that needs to be worked on. Personally, on the startup we're not working at this scale of requests, so I cannot tell you how it would work. Just try it out, and we'll try to fix things for you if you send us a PR. So, happy.
So I'm sorry, but we are a bit over time.
Yeah,
you'll be around, I guess. If there's any final
-4.
question in the audience that wants to be asked now, feel free.
I know it's a hard topic, so please feel free to ping me on Twitter or just catch me here in the conference and we can discuss. And the React PHP guys, Christian and Cis, are also really helpful on Twitter. You can almost ask them anything and they will answer things for you. So that also helps.
All right. Thank you, Albert. Thank you very much.